Hello, my friends. Today we cut through the noise, the propaganda, and the political theater, and look directly at the reality shaping the world right now. While Western leaders give speeches full of slogans and empty promises, the ground is shifting beneath their feet. Ukraine's war narrative is collapsing, power is being rearranged in Europe, and Moscow is now the place where decisions that actually matter are being made. You won't hear this version from CNN. You won't hear it from Brussels or Kiev. But the facts on the battlefield, the panic inside Ukraine's government, and the frantic diplomacy happening in the shadows all point to one undeniable truth. Russia is winning, and the West is running out of moves. So let's break down exactly what's happening, from the secret meetings in Ireland to the dramatic advances on the front lines, and why the political earthquake coming in Kiev may arrive far sooner than the West ever expected. President Zelensky stood in Dublin and delivered exactly the kind of script Brussels loves to hear. As a country with a long history of migration, as a people who have known conflict and sought refuge abroad, Ireland understands Ukraine, and for as long as Ukraine needs our help and support, Ireland will be there for you. Your struggle is our struggle, your success, our success. We are with you for as long as it takes. And of course, he closed with the obligatory Slava Ukraine. On paper, it sounded noble. In reality, it was the prelude to yet another check written on a collapsing European balance sheet and handed to a regime that is losing the war it pretends to be winning. Because while Dublin put on the emotional theater, the real game was playing out quietly in the background. Trump's envoy Witkoff passing through Ireland on his way to Moscow, Jared Kushner reportedly alongside him, and what a coincidence. Zelensky also arriving in Ireland at the same time. Officially, there are no reports of a meeting between Witkoff and Zelensky. Realistically, nobody believes that. The idea that Witkoff just happened to be in Ireland, Zelensky just happened to show up, and they didn't coordinate or talk is absurd. This was clearly a stopover to pass a message before Witkoff goes on to present Trump's P. So what was said in that unacknowledged meeting, you can almost hear the script, don't believe the reports that we're losing, Mr. Witkoff. We are actually winning. Russia is bogged down. The counteroffensive is working. Just keep the money flowing. And Witkoff, if he is at all honest, would have to tell him, it's over. The battlefield says it's over. The West may still be clapping in Parliament, but the lines on the, at the same time, there are persistent rumors, I stress, rumors, but telling ones that Zelensky has appeared in Kiev. If true, that would be very interesting timing. Zelensky abroad, Witkoff dropping in to quietly deliver an ultimatum, and Zelensky in the capital as the likely British MI6 candidate to replace the clown actor in the bunker. Because that's the British preference. Don't end the conflict, rotate the puppet. Replace the stand-up comedian with a failed military commander who allegedly played a role in sabotaging Nord Stream, and keep the war and the grift rolling. From London's perspective, swapping Zelensky for Zelensky means continuity. The same suicidal confrontation with Russia, but with a different face on the poster. While these shadow games play out, Russia isn't delivering speeches. It's taking territory. Putin v. CNN, Putin, Doug. The military orders match the political language. Putin instructed the armed forces to build a larger buffer zone in the north, in Kharkov and Sumy. That is not polite diplomatic wording. It is a hint that these regions are next in line to be brought under Russian control or placed under direct military pressure. And inside Ukraine, some of the political class can see the writing on the wall. More MPs in Kiev are quietly saying that Zelensky has to go. Some analysts in the capital whisper that the Green Goblin will be forced to step down by mid-December or at the latest by January 1st. Exit date, the turn of the year, as the fantasy of total victory finally. Meanwhile, the corruption scandal, symbolized by the golden toilet, is devastating the regime's image. The 150 million gift from Ireland to Kiev is a perfect example of what European taxpayers are waking up to. Money flushed away into a system that has already burned through tens of billions and is now scrambling for increasingly desperate schemes. One of those schemes is the latest joint venture between Ukraine and Norway. My precious Smigel, the man who has moved seamlessly from Prime Minister to Defense Secretary and unofficial chief lobbyist for the military-industrial complex, proudly announced on X a joint drone manufacturing project with Ukraine. The exact location of the facility is conveniently unspecified, but the logic is obvious. This is how you onshore the money you give to Ukraine. You announce a big assistance package, send the funds to Kiev, then recycle them back to your own industry through a joint venture producing weapons to keep the war going. This is also why the seizure of Russian frozen assets became such an obsession in Brussels. For Ursula and the kleptocrats, those assets were the last big pool of wealth they could touch to prolong Project Ukraine and feed their patrons. But they have run into a wall. The European Central Bank, under Christine Lagarde, has refused to backstop the plan. The ECB will not provide a guarantee behind the proposed 140 billion Ukraine loan based on those assets. In other words, they don't want to be left holding the bag when the lawsuits hit. Belgium, under pressure because Euroclear holds a large portion of those Russian assets, played the game cleverly. Brussels said to the EU, fine, we'll hand over the assets, but only if every single EU member state gives us a full, immediately available guarantee for 140 billion. And suddenly, many capitals that were loudly preaching about making Russia pay started to look at the actual numbers and say, absolutely not. Diplomats now murmur that it's politically impossible to sign what amounts to a blank check guarantee for Belgium. They still pretend the scheme is legally safe, but if it were truly safe, there would be no need for such gargantuan guarantees. They know perfectly well that outright theft of sovereign assets will end up in court and that Russia will win enormous damages. The EU wants the money. What it doesn't want is to be responsible for the consequences. The perfect arrangement, from Ursula's perspective, would be Belgium gives up the assets, the EU's leaders cash the political and financial benefits, and Belgium is held liable when the legal blowback comes. It is a terrible deal for Belgium and a great deal for the Euro elites. So far, Belgium is refusing to play the role of sacrificial goat. Good on them for that. But the West's fantasy politics don't stop with money. They extend to NATO itself. One of the ideas being floated, reportedly part of what Witkoff will put in front of Putin, is a scheme to bypass the fact that NATO membership for Ukraine is enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution. Kiev refuses to remove that clause. It's written into their basic law, they say, and nothing can be done. So Washington's workaround is to tell Russia, we will resolve the NATO issue from inside NATO. We will write a clause into NATO's own documents or bylaws promising that Ukraine will not actually be admitted, even though Kiev retains its constitutional aspiration. In other words, trust us, Mr. President. Yes, Ukraine's constitution keeps NATO membership as a goal, but NATO will secretly promise never to let them in. We'll put it in writing. You can rely on us. This is presented as a serious proposal, and CNN dutifully reports it, including the Florida meeting at Shell Bay Club, one of Witkoff's own developments, where Rubio, Witkoff, Kushner, and Umarov met to shape this so-called peace plan. The entire thing boils down to, we broke every previous security promise to Russia, but trust us this time, we'll write it into yet another Western document. As if that weren't enough, we now have the European Union trying to hand Trump a script. If he reaches a settlement with Russia, he must not pardon Putin for alleged war crimes. Think about this. The side that is losing the war, that is running out of shells, men, and money, is trying to dictate tribunal conditions to the side that is winning. Historically, tribunals are organized by the victors. The defeated do not set up courts to judge the winners. If I were in Brussels, I'd avoid talking about war crime tribunals at all, because if there are any, in the end, they are far more likely to be convened by Moscow than by Kiev. Russia is fully aware of these pressures. Maria Zakharova made that clear when she responded to NATO Commander Drayoni, the Dragon, as he likes to style himself, who publicly mused that it was time for NATO to consider preemptive strikes against Russia, cyber or military, or both. Zakharova's response was blunt: NATO needs to reconsider the risks of such insanity, calm down and back off. Again, the message from Moscow is straightforward. This is not 1999. Russia is not Yugoslavia. A preemptive attack on a nuclear power is not a video game scenario. And while Ukraine burns and Europe stumbles, Washington is busy trying to light another fire in Venezuela. Reports indicate that Trump held a War Council-style meeting in the Oval Office to discuss next steps in what is clearly a regime change operation against Caracas. This has nothing to do with narco-terrorism or democracy, and everything to do with removing a government that doesn't obey Washington's dictates. The scandal has already begun. In September, U.S. forces struck a boat in the Caribbean, then allegedly hit it again, a double tap, to kill survivors struggling in the water. Even an independent senator like Angus King has publicly warned that if the facts are as reported, the second strike is an obvious war crime and straightforward murder. So before this Venezuelan operation has even gotten going, the Trump administration and its Department of War are facing a serious scandal that Democrats will happily use later to attack Trump, Hegseth, and the entire national security team, especially if the midterms go badly. Trump reportedly had a 15-minute call with Maduro last week, telling him he had until Friday around November 29th, 30th to leave Venezuela or face the prospect of military action. Maduro allegedly replied that he would consider leaving if he and his family and roughly 100 associates were granted immunity, amnesty, and safe exit without fear of extradition or prosecution. Trump reportedly refused. Whether every detail of that account is precise or not, the trajectory is clear. Escalating pressure, regime change planning, and already a war crime scandal on the books. If I were advising Trump, I'd tell him, walk away from this. You're already in a mess before the first step of this adventure. It is a trap that your enemies at home will use against you. Meanwhile, in Europe's periphery, we get another preview of the future. In Bulgaria, huge protests erupted just as I left the country. Demonstrations against corruption, against inflation, against the country's decision to hike military spending for NATO and funnel more money into the military-industrial complex while ordinary people struggle. Bulgarians know what's coming on January 1st when the euro is introduced. Prices doubling, salaries stagnant, and national sovereignty quietly handed over to Christine Lagarde and the ECB. I've lived this in Cyprus and in Greece. It's always the same. You think you have economic problems now? Wait until you adopt the euro. Everything from food to fuel surges in price. The only thing that doesn't rise is wages. And once your currency is gone, your political sovereignty goes with it. If you dare to resist the austerity regime, if you push back even a little, the ECB simply turns off the tap. Cash dries up, ATMs stop working, banks close. Your so-called democracy becomes a branch office of Brussels and Frankfurt. That's the road Bulgaria is now being pushed down, even as it sends more of its scarce funds to NATO and Kiev. All of this is part of the same pattern. Western elites are willing to sacrifice the living standards of their own populations, loot frozen assets, and flirt with direct confrontation against a nuclear power, all to avoid admitting one simple fact. Russia has won the strategic contest in Ukraine. The clown world element of all this appears in places like Syria. Trump recently posted on Truth Social that things are going positively there and praised al-Shara, the former HTS al-Qaeda-linked figure al-Jolani, rebranded for Western consumption. Trump wrote that this man is working hard to improve Syria and that he likes him a lot. So we are, again, at the point where a former al-Qaeda leader is described as a partner for stability, while Russia, which has actually fought ISIS and stabilized large parts of the country, is endlessly demonized. If you want to understand how upside down the the Western narrative has become, you don't need more than that example. Back in Kiev, the palace intrigue around Zelensky continues. Ukrainian media report that when Yermak was forced to resign by the Green Goblin, there was a screaming match between them that lasted about 30 minutes. Yermak, according to these accounts, insisted he had done nothing wrong. Zelensky and his inner circle decided otherwise. Behind the scenes, you can almost see Podolyak's grin. This is his chance to edge closer to the bunker, to share the morning workouts, to play video games with the boss, to sideline his rival and become the new best buddy of the actor president. Western outlets once breathlessly reported how Zelensky and Yermak exercised together in the bunker. Now, that partnership seems to be breaking apart, like everything else in Kiev's inner circle. The propaganda machine, desperate to rehabilitate Yermak's image, even pushed out an AI-generated photo of him, already at the front, dressed in perfect military gear, ready to fight. Social media slapped a community note on it. Fake. Yermak is not going to the front lines. The elites in Kiev aren't about to trade their bunkers for trenches. At the same time, more credible reports say Zelensky has barred Yermak from leaving the country while investigations into his activities proceed. Perhaps he will find a way out. Kiev insiders often do, but the mere fact that such measures are being floated shows how unstable the regime has become. On one side, you have puppets fighting over positions in a collapsing court. On the other, you have Russia methodically advancing on the ground, consolidating control over key hubs, creating buffer zones, and making it very clear that it considers the current Kiev regime illegitimate and non-negotiable. In Europe, you have leaders who stand in parliaments and promise whatever it takes for as long as it takes, even as they refuse to personally guarantee the schemes they concoct to seize Russian assets and struggle to explain to their own voters why energy prices, food prices, and defense budgets are exploding. The gap between rhetoric and reality grows wider every day. And as that gap widens, the West is being forced into ever more bizarre contortions, praising jihadists as partners, talking about preemptive strikes on Russia as if it were a normal policy option, inventing complex legal fictions to pretend that NATO isn't expanding while constitutionally promising expansion, and planning new regime change wars while the last one in Ukraine is already lost. Russia, by contrast, is doing something very simple. It is letting facts on the ground speak louder than speeches. That is why, no matter how many glossy addresses we hear in Dublin or Brussels, the decisive conversations are happening elsewhere in Moscow, on the front lines and in the quiet rooms, where Western officials are finally being told the truth. The map has changed, the war is effectively decided, and the only question left is how long the West wants to keep pretending otherwise.